Good speaker.
Call Andrew Little.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm very pleased to rise and take a call on the Privacy Information Sharing Bill. Mr Speaker, in the relationship between the citizen and the state, the protections that the citizen have from intrusions by the state are absolutely fundamental. And these are principles that go back to the Magna Carta. They are fundamental to the sort of liberal democracy that we have and that we celebrate here today. And when the Privacy Act was put together, its genesis started with the fourth Labor government. It reflected some foresight about the direction that processes of government might take. Data was able to be stored in significant volumes and in new forms and electronically and so on. And so the Privacy Act has played a very important role in providing protections to citizens who must surrender their personal information to the state and, for that matter, conversely, for the state to function effectively and appropriately as well. And so we should not, when we are considering upgrades and updating to legislation as important as the Privacy Act, we should not take lightly the principles enunciated in it and the protections that they afford every citizen. And although Labor will support this bill and is supportive of reviews, comprehensive reviews and drafting of legislation like the Privacy Act, we nevertheless have some reservations that relate to the fact that the changes that are proposed for this bill are piecemeal. They are cherry-picked changes to the bill that give the appearance of suiting one or two purposes, but in fact could be used for others. The bill effectively relaxes the protections that are afforded by the existing Act and its privacy principles, or at least its personal information principles. The relaxation of those protections and of those rules are justified by what are described as better public services, a mantra that we've heard frequently in the last 5 years, and I'm still waiting to see what exactly the better public service is that we are meant to have. Certainly a rapidly de-staffed one, but I'm not quite sure where the better public service is. And it's also justified by an expressed need to deal with public health or public safety or life or health of an individual. Now, there is already an exception in terms of the application of the existing information privacy principles relating to public safety and prosecuting the need for public security and indeed an individual's health or safety. This bill relaxes the protections by changing the description or the proviso that goes with it. So whereas at the moment the threat to public safety or public health, or the threat to an individual's health or safety must be imminent, under the changes that would be brought about by this bill, the threat need no longer be imminent. And in fact, a new set of words are used. There must be an assessment in terms of in the interests of public safety. There must be an assessment of the likelihood of threat. There must be an assessment of the severity of the consequences if the threat is realised, and indeed of the time, an assessment of the time or potential time of the threat. Now, these are all much more weaselly words, to use a term. These are weasel words, and therefore they are more weaselly than the previous words, or more weaselly than other words that are frequently used. A bit like better public services. They are just as weaselly as those, if not more so. And so, Mr. Speaker, we can conceive of
How's that better public
faster, better. That's what they said. That's what they said about Superman, wasn't it?
How's it going?
Faster and better. But anyway, if I could draw the House's attention back, Mr. Speaker, to the matters that you and I are most concerned with, and that is that this bill here relaxes very important protections when it comes to the relationship between the citizen and the state. Now, we can all conceive of situations in which it is appropriate and desirable for information held by one state agency to be disclosed to another. And the classic situation is for the protection of children or a vulnerable child. And indeed, one of the biggest complaints we have sometimes of the regime we presently have for disclosure of threats or dangers, endangerment to children, is that agencies are reluctant to breach privacy principles. It's not just for children, but for patients in hospitals, and particularly mental health patients. And so you can see that there is a justification for having an exception to this sort of protection, not only for children, but for other vulnerable people as well. The classic Neil Pugmire situation, which of course led to the Protected Disclosures Act, which is really what this is about in privacy terms. But this relaxes those protections as well. And we don't want to repeat, well, of course, we want plenty of Neil Pugmires. We don't want to repeat of the situation he found himself in, which was common at the time, where people were reluctant to disclose information to hospitals, even when the interests or the safety of individuals and indeed the public as a whole were threatened. But notwithstanding those justifiable exceptions and the examples I've given, it is also possible to see how relaxing these protections can be abused. This is, as I articulated before, a much more opaque test. It's about carrying out an assessment of possibilities and probabilities. And so when the words affording protection are more conditional, are more contingent, are more opaque, are more difficult to define, then the interests of citizens are themselves under threat. And we have seen already how there is a lack of respect by this government, and the departments under its control, as it has conducted this government, have gone in the last year or so. And we've heard tonight already about what happened with the IRD. The details of thousands of taxpayers were wrongfully disclosed. We've seen in ACC. There have been mistakes in terms of the management of personal information in ACC, and I always favour cock-up over conspiracy when it comes to many of these things. But one thing that we know wasn't a cock-up and was utterly deliberate was the disclosure of the personal information entailed in an email from a woman called Michelle Bogue, who wrote to the minister and then found the contents of that message circulated to the public at large. That was a nasty and insidious thing, and it is the sort of thing that presently would simply not be permissible under the Privacy Act, but may well be inveigled through the more opaque test that must now apply. One thing that is absolutely crucial when it comes to matters like privacy and the protections that we give it is good enforcement. And this is another issue that I want to draw the House's attention to, is that even with the present Privacy Act, we are dependent on a robust, a strong and an independent Privacy Commissioner's Office to make sure that the law is upheld. And how disappointing it is that nearly a year on, would you believe it's nearly a year since the Bronwyn-Puller issue rose to public prominence, and a week or two later that information disclosed or provided to the minister in charge of ACC under the usual confidentiality arrangements was then disclosed. And a year on, the Privacy Commissioner has been investigating, and we are still none the wiser about what was behind that breach of privacy by this minister. Ironically and coincidentally, the minister in charge of this piece of legislation and the minister in charge of the Privacy Commissioner's Office, we have no word on the progress of that investigation and on what has happened in that regard. And so, sir, this draws attention to the very point I started off with, and that is the crucial importance of legislation like this in the relationship between the citizen and the state. We should not devalue it, we should not undermine it, we should pay very close attention to the sorts of changes in this legislation to make sure that rights are not abused and that citizens continue to be protected and are entitled to continue to respect the state and the way in which the state conducts its affairs.
I call Katrina Shanks.